Okay, Phyllis Nagy. The movie Carol took a long time to get from the page to the screen, and you were involved right from the very beginning. So, you want to tell us about the process and some of the ups and downs of it?
Sure. Um, I mean, this came to me in the way that any movie or most movies will come to a writer when the writer doesn't generate it themselves. A producer says, "Do you want to write this?" And little did I know then how long this would take, and what would happen along the way. But actually, given the results, I kind of feel like I want everything to take 18 years to reach the screen. You can't really argue with it. This film was developed in England at Film 4, which I think is probably a significantly different process than, say, having a film developed here by a studio or even a big indie producer. Film 4 really hands their writers their heads. This is down to you. If we can't make this, it's because your shitty script is wrong. And we don't have big bucks, so we can't get 3 other writers to come in and fix it. So it was a baptism by fire, really, the first couple of years. But also great because I had the time to work out the basic, fundamental structure of the film, and also its tone and the way that it handles exposition, none of which has ever really changed throughout the course of the 18 years. Not fundamentally. So the decision not to use voiceover as a means to communicate Therese's inner life.
Mhm.
A choice probably others would have made, but not something that sat easily with me in what I always knew should be a movie that described the process of falling in love from the inside out. I know when I sat, and this is the first screenplay that I was paid to write, so I was stupid in those days, and I thought, this can't be that hard. But yeah, it was tremendously difficult, but it wasn't difficult because I had people on my back saying, you have to do this. It was difficult because there's a choice I think all screenwriters make in adaptation very early on. Do I do the easy thing, which is rely on voiceover, certain other tropes and tricks of the trade, or do I really try to do something that is not reliant on a sentimental button pushing sort of thing? How do you really get to an emotional core that's attractive to actors or directors? Because it's one thing on the page, obviously, it's another thing in the flesh. And I'd say I had 18 years to figure that out, but really it was, 5 drafts to figure it out, say, and a handful of polishes. We all know, you sit around for 4 years while nothing happens and you do other things on long projects like this. And then every once in a while it comes back. And that's pretty much the process on Carol until it became a movie, which happened very quickly when I think we were all least expecting it. And then you all go, oh, okay. What else do we have to do now? Hurry, hurry, hurry. But for me, the important things were always what I'm proud of that are there in the script and on the screen.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting you bring up voiceover and the lack thereof in the movie, because I think one of the great qualities is that so much of it is just told in these little looks and touches and glances, these subtle things that sort of happen between the lines, and something that I think gets taken for granted when it comes to screenwriting, but it's nevertheless there. You care to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always curious about what people think screenplays are, and how they're put together, and what constitutes dramatic action in the screenplay, etc. You know, for me, it's all about structure and utilizing behavior and image structure in your script to tell a story that is visual. So even though Carol, the script is full of, it's full of dialogue. I actually love it when people say, well, there's not much. It's like, really? Dialogue. But what it isn't is, it's largely elliptical. It's largely allowing the actors to do the heavy lifting with subtext and with, you know, when you're falling in love with someone, okay, you don't sit around and talk about it, do you? You don't say, hey, I love you because you're fat, or I love you because you're thin, or you know, you have great teeth. Actually, that's a good line. I mean, you might say you have great teeth. But, the great joy is in trying to construct something that allows for flirtation, for silences. I mean, there are a certain number of those things that are built into a script. But if you construct something like that properly, what it does is it gives the actors, the director, everybody license to see exactly how far you can go with things like that, and also in post and in editing. So all of those things about Carol are present and embraced and run with in what I think is a great way. So if I think it's easy. I know what people mean when they say it's all between the lines. Yes, but you have to have the lines. You have to have the writing that's there in order to play what's between them. If you have nothing but conversations in which people say exactly what they mean, there's no room for that. And what you get then is just, I don't know what you get, but I know that you don't get what we ended up with, whatever that may be. It's sort of right. Chekhovian. Not that I'm comparing myself to Chekhov, but in that way, there is a writer who absolutely is subtextual. So all of us were going for that. And it was my great fortune to wind up with a bunch of collaborators that felt exactly the same way. Otherwise, you know, who knows what might have happened.
Yeah, and I mean, the film took so long to get made, and I know that it went through several different hands. So when it finally got to Todd Haynes, I'm curious what that collaboration was like, you know.
Yeah, no, that was great. Of course, we didn't know if he would do it because he'd never worked on something, directed something that he hadn't written or written with someone. So who knew? But when he said yes, we had a series of conversations about, you know, every director has a different point of entry. And by that time, I'd heard it all, you know, from who was interested in you know, the feminist angle to who was interested in the sex angle to whatever you care to talk about. But until Todd, there was no one who seemed to be interested in what the script was interested in. And that was a huge relief because it didn't really have to be that way. So that's what movies, you know, it's luck of the draw. And I got very lucky in this way. What fascinated Todd in our discussions was his obsession with classic love stories that had a subjective point of view, brief encounter being chief among them. And so looking at the script of Carol, which always, as opposed to the book, which is mostly, it's Therese's point of view, which is sometimes reliable and sometimes not. The script always shifted from Therese to Carol, and from vulnerable party to vulnerable party as what was being focused on. And Todd wondered if we could find a way to use a framing device, a la Brief Encounter, a la some of these other films that he was particularly looking at in those days. And so we talked about that a lot. And I went back and took the scene of Therese and Carol that naturally occurs at the end, right? And found a way to break that up and start with the introduction of an insignificant character, just like a lot of Highsmith mysteries do, actually. And I think it worked out pretty well, because the stakes, when that scene is repeated and when you realize what that oaf has interrupted at the beginning of the film, hopefully has more resonance for people who are with it, you know, up until that point. And so that was the major work of the draft I did for Todd. And also, yeah, that was it. That was really the structural, huge structural beat. And that came from discussions with him about how he likes to enter a story when he's directing or telling it.
Right. Speaking of Patricia Highsmith, you knew her personally. And I think a lot of people who are familiar with her more famous works, like all the Ripley novels and Strangers on a Train, would be surprised to learn that she wrote this as well. But, you know, in a lot of ways, it's really one of the most personal windows into who she really was. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I didn't read the book while she was alive. The way that she spoke to me about it, there was something that I thought I shouldn't read this in case I don't like it or I say the wrong thing about it, because it was clearly very personal to her. She had worked at Bloomingdale's one Christmas, very much like Therese works at Frankenberg's, and she saw this woman and instantly imagined a life for her at the same time as Pat was getting ill with the flu. And the way she told it was, she went home, she got sick, she was delirious, and in a fever dream of a couple of weeks, wrote The Price of Salt. Later on, you discover that actually, yes, that's true insofar as it goes, but she also had an ex who had custody issues, and so she did what writers do, but she didn't really have very good things to say about the book. It wasn't one of her personal favorites, and I'm not sure if that was willful on her part, just to sort of distance me from wanting to engage with the book, because it was personal, or if she really thought it wasn't up to what she thought her best work was. I don't know, and never will. But a couple of years after she died, I did read the book, and I thought, well, she's wrong in significant ways about this, but I get why it's not something that she was confident enough to claim as her own for all those years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there are certain similarities in tone and in theme to some of those more famous books, particularly, I think, in the, we talked about this a while back, the sense of melancholia that the character of Carol has, you know, much
Yeah,
like.
yeah. There's an unsettled quality to Carol, an unfinished quality to her. Actually, that's far more active than the unfinished quality in Therese, who you would think would be far more of a malleable creature because of her age, but that's not so. And I think that's because that's Pat's stand-in, Therese. And Pat seems to have, you know, sprung fully formed from the thigh of somebody, you know, and always had that powerful sense of who I am to her. Whereas Carol, in the book, as I recall, she drinks a lot. She's not unhappy, but she's restless in the way that all of the classic Highsmithian psychopaths are restless, or the peeping Toms, or the people in unhappy marriages. And Carol seems to have all of those qualities to some degree, except she's a woman. And that's the one thing that Highsmith didn't really write about. She didn't write a psychopathic woman. The closest we come is Edith in Edith's diary. But then she's crazy. But, you know, it's her son who's the murderer. Pat reserved her venom and her admiration for men. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and the book was also just very much ahead of its time in its portrayal of LGBT rights, and I mean, really ahead of its time today as well. If you talk to some people, I wonder, you know, we're living in a time now where gay marriage is legal in all 50 states, but there are still people who want to repeal that. How a movie like Carol can help in the cause and maybe help change people's perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I hope it's true. Yeah, gay marriage is legal here in most, yeah, it's legal. Whether it's accepted is a whole other ballgame. We live in a very privileged environment here in LA or in New York, or where most film people tend to congregate anyway, and don't realize that our friends in Mississippi are not having the same experience, or in South America or in China. And if a movie like Carol, which steadfastly insists on presenting lives lived as lives rather than as position papers, I think that is the thing that stands a better chance of changing minds, if minds are to be changed at all. And if it touches, if it moves people on a level that is more profound than let me sit in the theater and wipe a tear away from my eyes. If you go away from it and keep thinking about it, maybe. And that would be my hope for what maybe the movie can affect some change in somebody's mind. But I think, you know, we're talking about movies, and we're talking about a very complex political situation here that I'm not sure, maybe we should bring the Supreme Court to see it. Maybe that would help, or some of the Republicans.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, speaking personally for myself, I'm not a woman, I'm not gay, but I totally identified with what these two women were going through, and I think that's sort of the extraordinary thing about the movie, is that it is about universal feelings and universal truths, falling in love, not being able to quite be yourself, feelings of loss, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think what you've just said is exactly what has to happen in order. No, we didn't have to change your mind about, the need for basic understanding and tolerance. But I think, if there are three people somewhere whose mind you change about what it means to make a gay movie even, or how people are presented, then I think the movie's done its job. And I hope it just gets out to communities which need it as a sort of, I hesitate to say example of something because that sounds very pretentious, but as a document that's there, that's reflecting in what I hope is a real way how people lead their lives, not how gay people lead their lives, but how human beings fall in love and combat obstacles, some of which have to do with prejudice.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on the film, and good luck during awards season.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah.